to me, that's where the thought of decisions in games kind of loses its steam and becomes more of like oh, well, you're not actually letting me decide how the story goes. You're deciding how I get to the end of the story instead.
When talking about video games, people have the conversation about a favorite genre, whether you care about stories in games or not. But even within that, I think a fascinating conversation is this whole concept of decision in video games. Whether you play something like Mass Effect or a story and narrative-based game like Life is Strange, where it's all about those decisions, there's the underlying question of, do any of those decisions actually matter? How much do they actually change the overall scope of the game and the story? Is it superficial, where it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, or is it something that actually progressively changes things? We're going to be having this conversation on another exciting episode of A Cast of the Past, with a brand new episode available each and every Sunday with yours truly, Juan Velas from Puerto Rico, and joining me, we have from London, Ontario, one Keith Hamilton. Now, Keith, in your case, this is an interesting question. How much do you actually care about decisions in video games? Any kind of game that gives you that option of, hey, here's A, B, and C, here's how you're going to respond and answer, is that something you actually look forward to?
It is, if there's a payoff to it. If it's something that just you always end up in the same place, well, then it's something that becomes exponentially more disappointing. But when it works, it's a great thing.
Yeah, it really is. And we really want to thank somebody from the Cast of the Past Discord, One Midnight Outlaw. And he directly not just suggested this episode, we thought like, hey, this is a great conversation. So I'm actually going to read his post, which you can check out at acastofthepast.com/Discord. And he wrote, so this idea just hit me. I'll throw down something I've been thinking about. On one hand, I love that some games give me agency through multiple choices. On the other, I hate how they often use that as a means of hiding a true path, and he's using true in quotes. Maybe an episode debating whether or not multiple choices in games is good, bad, or just needs to be handled properly. Examples: Mass Effect, no true ending, but tons of choices. Layers of Fear, literally around 100 subtle choices or more that affect the ending that you get. And based on that, I actually want to ask you, Keith, directly. We both played Mass Effect. It's one of my favorite games of the decade, one of your favorite games of all time as well. How do you feel, like, objectively speaking, about these games that they say there's not one true ending because you create the ending based on the experience? Do you like that? Or do you prefer a game that's like, hey, whatever you do, like, this is the end of the journey?
Yeah, because Mass Effect is a game where if they say that there's no true ending, well, it's an outright lie. Because especially, like, I think you can extend this to most BioWare games. They're a company that, do choices really well, but they do it a specific way. I've always looked at it in the form of a diamond, and I'm talking like a baseball diamond, not the type that you would put on your wife's finger if you love her very, very much. But so you have the top of the diamond, right? So that's the start of the game. That's where you're beginning. That's where, like, everybody starts at that same point. Then you go outwards. Then you go outwards to the middle of the diamond, and you have those two parallel points at the thickest part of a diamond, and that's where all your decisions lie. And when they talk about choices in video games, like, do you want to do A, do you want to do B, do you want to do C, take the red pill, take the blue pill, that's where all of that lies, and that's where all of the decisions and the uniqueness and the different story threads that you can take live. But especially in BioWare games, like, one of my favorite games, like you said, is Mass Effect. But once you look at it as both as a trilogy and as individual games, you've got the bottom of the diamond, where it doesn't matter what choice you made in a game. That's when the ending is the ending. It everybody gets funneled back into this one small point, and everybody experiences the exact same thing at the ending. And I know all games aren't like that. It's not just like a blanket statement of that's how it is, but that's the majority of them. There are examples that don't do that, but most of the quote-unquote decisions in games always have that funnel point back at the very end because, well, like anything else, games need to have an ending, and you need to be able to create that ending, so it means funneling people back. And to me, that's where the thought of decisions in games kind of loses its steam and becomes more of like oh, well, you're not actually letting me decide how the story goes. You're deciding how I get to the end of the story instead.
That to me has always been, even as a kid, I remember some early RPGs, they gave you like very rudimentary options that you knew didn't really affect anything. But to me, I was always in the mindset that if this didn't really have any specific consequence, just don't give me that, because I get it, you're trying to be immersive, but really you're just kind of lying to me. And based on what you were talking about with the diamond, I think the summary is, what is more important to you as a gamer? Is it the journey or is it the destination? You know, we've talked about Mass Effect, and I think the conclusion of that trilogy, let's not forget, there were actual like petitions to change the ending, right? So here you have an example.
Desperately, they wanted it so bad that they chose a fan theory was more important and more factual than the actual ending that it was given.
And I think the problem with that is, I don't play games for the story. I like games that have a basic story, right? Where it's you're here and you got to escape. You know, you have to rescue somebody. But I like it when a game introduces the concept of once you obtain this, you knew the game concluded. The challenge with a game giving me so many options as to like, we're still talking about BioWare because it's something that we grew up with like Knights of the Old Republic. You could choose to be a good guy or a bad guy. The challenge sometimes in many different games is that when you allow me a lot of creativity, I can have even more creativity in my head, because it's like, oh, I'm making this decision, but in my head, I'm creating my own character. But if the person that wrote the story of the game, if that doesn't align with what I was thinking about, then I feel cheated, because I was like, oh, here I was thinking this is building up to the ultimate conclusion, and then, oh, the writer just went like, psych. And I think that happens far too often, because like it's like what you mentioned there. We can't help but not just think about where we are right now, but it's like, oh, where's the story going to go? You and I have a conversation, and that conversation can be way more fun or interesting than even the actual conclusion of the game, right?
It's true, because your imagination runs wild, especially as you're experiencing this 20, 30-hour event. Like, it's one thing that almost works against movies or against video games opposed to movies, because you're sitting down, you're watching a movie. By the time you've really had the ability for your mind to go wild on how this ends, you're kind of already there. You have a very finite amount of time, an hour and a half, 2 hours to experience that entire conclusion. If you're playing a giant game like a Mass Effect, like a Knights of the Old Republic, you are doing it over multiple sessions, unless you're like a machine. So you've had time to put it down. You've had time to spend your next day thinking about it, your next week before picking it up again. And you're giving your imagination all this time to run wild and thinking about how, well, I just did this in this section. How does this factor into everything else? And if it does, in a satisfying way, you feel good about it, and then you're almost left on the other side of it thinking to yourself like, well, that was disappointing, and you're critiquing a game just because you let your imagination run wild, almost unfairly, really.
I forget which games, and I'm hoping that either you remember a few examples, or somebody you could give us a shout out Twitter, a cast of the past. There have been some games that give you an option. I think 3D Dot Game Heroes is actually one of them on the PS3, that they ask you, it's like, hey, do you want to go on this journey? And you can actually choose no, and hypothetically, the game will end, right? Because it's like, hey, if you're giving me the power, it's like,
Yeah.
I don't need to go down that
Another
journey.
one like that was Far Cry 4, where at the beginning of the game, the main antagonist is like hanging out with you, and he's like, oh, I'll be back in about 15 minutes. And if you don't progress the game and just wait the 15 minutes, he shoots you, and then you get an ending.
Exactly. So I bring that up. Why? Because as cool as it is, in the grand scheme of things, that does present the problem, which is a writer knows, like, I mean, they have to, like, whatever decision they make, they have to continue progressing through the story, which presents a challenge because any decision we make has to involve some kind of actual logical roller coaster like conclusion, right? With like all these twists and turns, which begs the question of like, how many small decisions do we get to choose in a game as opposed to a bigger one? I think like whenever we get these questions of like, hey, maybe you have somebody that joins your party or doesn't. Like I remember Star Ocean on the PS1 was one of the first games that really gave me a lot of decision-making power over, hey, do you want this person in your party or not? And you could actually opt out. And that does change the conclusion of the game, but it's very minimal, right? Like the game still ends. I don't feel like I missed out anything. A lot of people actually went back and got the other characters like, oh, cool, I get to see that person's background, but it's not like a completely different ending, right?
It's true, and it's interesting that you bring that up because a lot of times when we think of decisions in a game, we think about narrative decisions and how they affect the story, but from a gameplay perspective, like that's been happening forever, far beyond the games like had big expansive cinematic stories. To use RPGs as an example, you've been making decisions since the original Final Fantasy of like, oh, do I want to equip this item? Would the game be better if I did? Would the game be worse if I did? Then those are decisions that you have to think of on like a big and small scale. Think about when you were talking about Star Ocean, the thing that came to mind was a Genesis game called Shining Force, which was like a Fire Emblem game before Fire Emblem existed. An ARPG, an action RPG? Like that had permadeath in it. So all of a sudden you're making these decisions like, can a pivotal character to the story just be lost? And am I willing to accept that? Or am I going to restart my run because I really don't want to lose this guy?
But see, I actually like that because Fire Emblem does that. But another really good example, as you were talking, I remember with Metal Gear Solid 4, one of the first angles that they came out with was, with this game, they're going to give you a little bit more decision. So if you want to take the stealth route, you can do that. But if you want to go a little bit more guns blazing, the game was more action-oriented, I'm going to say, than previous ones. But guess what? You still had to progress through the same area. The story was still the same. And in many ways, I prefer that because from a game design standpoint, you're being honest with me. Like, hey, we're giving you a bunch of options, but this is the story. I prefer that because at least the journey rather than the destination, I feel like, you know, when you play like Gauntlet, right, you can choose between a sword-based character or a magician. I'm still in the same journey that maybe you had, but you and I can have different conversations about, hey, the skill level or, you know, long range versus short range attacks. And I know that's a personal preference. Maybe not everybody agrees with that.
It is, because I'm on the other side of that where I look at a game, I think a great example of what you're talking about are the Deus Ex games, where there's a bunch of combat scenarios, and then now you're looking at things like skill trees and deciding, well, I want to tech into being able to go guns blazing and have lots of health, lots of armor, big damage guns. That's how I'm going to play this game. Well, you're presented with these scenarios and you still see all the options of, well, if I was more into hacking, I could have done this instead of going in guns blazing. Or if I was in stealth, I could have had these options. And then you're left looking at things that you can't do instead of focusing on the things you can do. That's how I experience those games. And then I'll get like bummed out of like, well, did I do the wrong thing? Did I spec the wrong choice? Should I restart the game? Like I've probably restarted Oblivion close to 80 80 times in my life. Because like, oh, well, I wanted to play a mage today, but now I want to play like a sword, or I want to play a two-handed guy. And then tomorrow I want to play a thief. And you're left wanting what you don't have more than what you actually have. So I think there is a way to do the gameplay side of that negatively as well.
And I think the exact same thing you said now applies to the story part, because as a gamer, let's think back to the very first games. Like Pong, you hope to win. You have to beat the other person.
You have to make the decision of, do you want to make the paddle go up, or do you want to make the paddle go down?
That choice. With Pac-Man, you want to see the score go up. But when it's about story-driven games, you want a story that is rewarding. Now, let's say you and me play the exact same game, but it is a game that has a lot of different decisions. And I'm talking about like some real decisions, right? Where a character can die. Like, I'm not talking about spoilers for any game, by the way. It's a hypothetical example. Say I play the game and I'm like freaking bummed out because I'm like, man, the main character died. I'm chatting with you and I'm thinking like, well, obviously he died for you. You're like, oh no, like he actually got to save the day. I can think of that and I can either get frustrated, I can get motivated to maybe go back. And I think that depends on the gamer, but I think that is the challenge, right? Which is like, regardless of the choice that you make, you got to make the person feel like, you know what? I made these decisions and I feel satisfied with that. Do you think that games, generally speaking, have done a good job? And I'm actually going to bring up an article from thegamer.com in a little bit talking about some games that have actual consequences. But generally, do you think that whenever they give you multiple options, they do feel rewarding?
I think so, as like a blanket overall statement, but the problem with that is, like the example you mentioned, if you have a less positive choice, then somebody is going to have a better experience than somebody else. So you're left wondering, well, is my time worth less than them? Or maybe that's just a me thing. Like, why, like, okay, well, that sucks for me because I didn't get the good thing. Like, I'm going to kind of call Midnight Outlaw, he's a good friend of mine, out on this, where when we played Mass Effect 2 together, there's like a certain like there's almost like math happening in the background of, can you actually save all of these characters and get an achievement for it at the end of the game? Well, I, out of complete dumb luck, I was able to get that achievement first try. I didn't look anything up. I completely BS'd my way into it, where he had to play the game 2, 3, 4 times in order to be able to get that no one left behind achievement. Because that decision was there, because those storytelling choices were there that had consequence behind them, now all of a sudden this thing that I lucked into and only had to spend 30 hours doing took him like 90 to 100. So is that actually okay? And like, part of me wants to say no, because now all of a sudden you're making like a less enjoyable experience for somebody, where at the end of the day you're spending money on games, so shouldn't you get the most enjoyment out of them possible in the amount of time that is right for you?
And I think it's a difficult conversation, because I know somebody can comment, and rightfully so, like, hey, I mean, you got 30 hours out of it, or 90 hours out of it. And whether it's bad or good, it's an experience. But I think the challenging part is, let's keep talking about BioWare, or let's say any game where there's Infamous is actually another good example. A game that's like, oh, you can be the good guy or you can be the bad guy. For me, ethically speaking, I always like to play the good guy. But let's be real, the more fun experience tends to be the bad. Exactly. So I've had the internal conflict in games. So it's like, okay, I'm giving a lot of options, and this is like a really good guy option. This is a really bad one. But do I decide based on gameplay and what I get there, or based on story? And then the problem is, like, I end up feeling unsatisfied because I have to sacrifice something. And that poses, it's like a character isn't just black or white, right? It's not just like, oh, you're a good guy or you're a bad guy. Even the most heroic superhero like Superman can also be a bit of an asshole at points. So I think it's like, it is impossible to satisfy everybody. So I'm not just saying like make this blank generic character, but it really is a challenge that unless you have an incredible writing team, sometimes they brought in writers from movies and it doesn't work because it's a video game. Like, I can make a decision. How many games have we played? It's like, oh, you got to save somebody. And I'll be like, no, actually, I'm going to like just wander off for like the next 2 hours. And I can finish the mission.
The world's ending, but I can go deliver flowers for this person.
Exactly. So you have to account that while writing this very complicated story with decision making. And do you think it is even worth long term to emphasize so much on a whole lot of decision making, or do you think long term it is a benefit when you talk about like voice acting, especially, right? It's like, I think this is a very different conversation where a game was based on text. It's a lot easier, right? It's like, oh, you can write anything on the spot, but now you got to write a script and then you got to do the voiceover. You got to make sure that the voiceover is tied into the decision, but you got to make sure that the animation is also tied into the expression of the character. Do you think that's all worth it, or would you prefer now, like Keith Gaming in 2020 and beyond, do you want just like, hey, feed me the story?
I think if you, like, going back to the diamond example, even though I've been talking negatively about it to a degree, I think it's the way to go, honestly, where you have your point A and the start of the game, and you are slowly getting to point B, and you can make these small decisions along the way that affect things and how the story plays out. Because for me as a gamer, I care more about the destination, or not the destination. I care more about the journey than the destination. So if I'm enjoying my time getting there and I can make a few decisions that kind of cater to how I want to do it, then that's great. And it's done best when I don't have to feel bad about it. Going back to the Infamous example, because I think it's a great one, I had to sacrifice kind of like playing a different way than I would want to. Like, there are situations where being the bad guy means like really being a bad guy or being a dick, and that's not how I wanted to play it, but I had already committed to getting the cool powers, so now, well, I kind of have to do it. When you're shoehorned in that way, I think it's a bad experience. But when a narrative lets you choose your own path and not be penalized for it, then I think that's the best way to go about it. And then everybody ends up at the same place. Every game needs a final boss, and maybe it's a little different how you get there, but being able to end on the same final boss as everybody else, I think that's an important thing, because it lets you it lets everybody have the same experience.
Yeah, and it's a nice conversation that, how did you beat that final boss, or what did you think of that final beat of the story? And I would like to actually quickly bring up this article, as I mentioned, from thegamer.com, 10 games where your choices have an actual consequence. And I think it would be cool for us maybe next year or at some point to actually pick a game where you do really have definitive different endings, right? And maybe we bring that here. So everybody,
I would have loved to do one earlier this year, but that didn't work out.
Yeah, we tried. We almost did. So maybe something that doesn't take 60 hours to beat, but we'll be talking about that in the future. But it is going to be cool, right? Just looking at this quickly, we have a couple of games. Number 10, Until Dawn, which is a horror-based game on the PS4. So it's like a horror thriller movie. Did you play this one, Keith?
I did play it, but I haven't beaten it, and I think it does choice in a fun way, because it's, like you said, it's a horror movie, and the choices you make either decide if characters live or die, and then it's one of those games that, well, you're going to get a different ending than everybody else depending on if you made the right choice.
Exactly, and same here. I also own it, but it was like one of the first games I bought on PS4 and haven't picked it up since, but I think it's cool. For those that don't know, it takes about 10 hours to beat, but it's a completely narrative-based game, so you're not physically like moving in the traditional sense as you would in other games. Another one, kind of similar, but this one does give you some more gameplay elements. It's Detroit Become Human. This game came out a few more years ago. This one was definitely completely narrative-based, to the point that when you finished a mission, or let's call it a chapter of the story, they actually gave you a timeline saying like, oh, like you took this ending. Did you know there's actually 7 other endings that you can get? So it's
Ugh.
actually mixing not just the conclusion, but it does spark that curiosity of, do you want to go back and check out the other things that you could have done?
Yeah, to me, that's just overwhelming. And I've played David Cage games in the past. I didn't play Detroit.
Yeah, it's heavy. Now, something very different.
Unlike another heavy game.
Oh, shut up. It's also in this list, so save that for the next one here. The Witcher 3, which is very different because that's a more traditional RPG. Obviously, The Witcher became just a phenomenon now, sparking a Netflix series, based on the books and all of that stuff. I have not played The Witcher, any of them. I think I played a little bit of the first one, like when it first came out. Did you have any experiences with this one?
I've played The Witcher 3. I tried getting into 2, but not so much enjoyment out of that one. But that's another great example of games where you're all going to end up in the same place. It's another game that has a final boss, but the decisions you make along the way that impact the micro moments of the moment or the game that you just the beat by beat, the way that characters interact with each other, the way that characters interact with you, those are where your decisions are most important from a story angle and get you where you need to go. And they did it quite well.
Now, another game we've talked about quite a bit, so just going to quickly bring it up here, is Mass Effect 2. I think to me, I have played Knights of the Old Republic before this game. I have played other BioWare games, but I think this was the first game where I was really just interested in like relationships. I think you brought up something that maybe we haven't even dabbled into. It's like, this is the journey, but along the way, you can actually choose to have relationships or not, that maybe they don't really change a whole lot along the way, but it is curious to see how those play out. What's your take on relationships as an optional part of the journey?
I mean, if you're going to do character-based games and things where characters drive the narrative, I think you almost have to have it, and not in form of like, oh, make the characters bang kind of way, but just if you're interacting with these personalities, you're going to, whether consciously or subconsciously, build relationships with them, and you're going to pick favorites and want to learn more about these characters. That's one of the biggest selling points, in my opinion, of the Mass Effect games, are the character relationships and building this team and building this squad and learning about all their backstories and how, deep these characters are. The more you learn about them, the more you get out of them, and it's a great experience that way. But it's so important. It's so important for building a world and building a universe.
Yeah, I think when done well, it's like the curiosity of, hey, I'm making these decisions. Like, where is this gonna go? What does that say about my character? I think it's really nice. It's like the frosting on the cake, right? You're not going in for the frosting, but it's nice to have that option just to see another chapter of the story unfold. And
absolutely.
And but continuing with BioWare, number 6 on this list, we have Dragon Age Origins, which I just started playing, so I can say pretty much none of it because I had never played it before. I have it on PS3. Look, I'm not going to beat it. I'm not going into it for that because I know it's a super long game. But I want to be able to see how far I get because I hear so much about this game. What is the from based on this topic, right, about story and decisions? What is so good about this one, even more so or differently than Mass Effect, from what you know?
I mean, I'm not going to say it's better, but it's Mass Effect-like, where, again, the decisions that you make are always going to have you end up in the same place. You're always going to fight the same final boss, but it's another strong game like BioWare up until this generation was so great at doing, where it's less about the big scale things and more about the interpersonal relationships along the way, forming your party and really getting to know your party. That's the best part about Dragon Age, in my opinion. The characters that surround you and how your it's less about how your decisions impact the world and more about how they impact the people around you. And they do such a phenomenal job in that game of that.
Now, at number 5, let's talk about David Cage once again. Heavy Rain, which is, I think Ryan is a big fan of this game, if I'm not mistaken. What about you? Because it's a game that I've seen very polarizing opinions where either people love it or loathe it. It's like I've seen very little people just kind of go like meh about it.
Yeah, honestly, but I'm one of those people where I'm kind of meh about it, where I enjoyed my time with it, but I don't look back at it fondly, because it's one of those games, again, that has so many endings to it that you can put 10 hours into it and get the worst possible ending. Or you could luck your way into the best ending. It's kind of a crapshoot, and if you are not the type of person that wants to play through the same experience multiple times, you could walk away with a bad experience in that game, feeling poorly about the choices that you make, and I think that's unfortunate. That's not my cup of tea.
See, now this next game, I'm going to have to play it at some point because I keep hearing about it. Alpha Protocol, which is a game I did not expect to see on this list. So this is an actual action role-playing game, espionage, RPG, third-person shooter type of game. I think it's part of the PS3, Xbox 360 generation. Have you played it?
It is. I haven't, but I've heard a lot about it, how it's very Mass Effect-like.
Which is interesting because I look at the screenshots, and to me, like obviously this is just like superficial expressions. It just looks like another shooter. But every time I see in a list, people are so passionate about it. So like, I like that because I think when you talk about these story decisions in games and all that, it kind of falls under the traditional like RPG or the Telltale type game formula. So it's nice to see that's
Try
like,
saying
hey,
that 10 times fast.
yeah,
Telltale
try
type.
that. Yeah. But it's nice, right? When other genres or types of games do also take those elements.
Agreed.
And number 3, you've actually talked about this one, which is Deus Ex. They're bringing up Deus Ex as a series. They're not really pointing out any specific one here. Any other comments about Deus Ex?
Not really. From the ones that I've played, that's more where gameplay decisions matter, choosing how you want to go through the environments and levels that they give you. And yeah, I always feel so overwhelmed with stuff like that, focusing on the things that I can't do instead of the things that I can.
And then here's another game I keep hearing about with very divided opinions. At number 2, Beyond Two Souls. It's about a young girl named Jodie who has a psychic connection with Aiden, a weird, mysterious entity. You can switch between these two as you progress through the game, and each of them sees things very differently. Did you play this one?
I did not, because Heavy Rain was my last David Cage game, and haven't really been interested in them since, so I totally missed this one. I remember there being a lot of negativity towards the game itself when it first came out, but that completely went right by me.
Now, this last one here is one I may actually start playing very soon. I recently got a new PC, and this is one of the first games that I downloaded, not because it's like a stress test or anything, but it's just like I keep hearing about it. So number 1 in this list is Life is Strange. Have you played this one?
I haven't, but I've heard really, really good things about it, akin to like The Walking Dead Season 1.
Yeah, so just reading here the paragraph, if you haven't heard people rave about this game, then where have you been? I mean, we're right here, but people love this game, and rightfully so. The concept of this puzzling story is pretty unique. It's about a character who can rewind time and play out choices differently. Interesting. So they actually play into the whole decision-making as part of the mechanic. It's another game that seems to explore the butterfly effect. The whole point of the game is exploring the effects of different choices, and the characters are written so beautifully that it's a really endearing plot. This actually really motivated me to play it.
Yeah, hearing that, I want to check it out even more.
Yeah, I really do. So everybody, just a quick plug. If I do play that, I may perhaps stream it at twitch.tv/MrPlayerJuan. Given the plug here, Keith. I already did it, but can I do it?
You mean that you're going to stream that maybe one day at twitch.tv/MrPlayer1? Maybe I'll have to come check it out at twitch.tv/MrPlayer1. Maybe it'll show up on your YouTube channel.
That could happen. But like as a closing thing, one real good benefit of a game that is completely narrative and story based like this, mentioned Telltale games that are not like 60 hours long, is that you can enjoy just as much playing it as you do watching it. Like, I still remember you playing The Walking Dead back when you streamed like many years ago, and I love that experience. Like, I didn't hold that controller one time, but I felt like you were there with me because I love the concept of watching you decide, being like, okay, it's not I have no decision-making power here. So I'm actually seeing not just the decision happen in the game, I'm looking at you as a gamer struggling to make that choice. And I think that's even like a subgenre. It's like viewer porn for decision-making in games, right?
Yeah, it's true. It's a weird meta layer, but absolutely, it's adding another layer of personality to the story that is being like presented to you, because now it's not just what would I choose, it's, well, what did this person that I know choose, and do I agree with it?
Exactly. So everybody, please let us know, what's your take about this conversation? Do you think that based on the games that you play, whatever genre, right? There's no wrong answer, because you as a gamer, maybe you haven't delved into a lot of genres that do involve a lot of decision making, but for the ones that you have, do you feel like your decisions actually matter? Let us know by joining the Discord over at acastofthepast.com/Discord. Want to give a huge shout out once again to Midnight Outlaw for the recommendation. We have a suggestions tab there, so if anybody signs up, you join in, you're like, hey.
If you are listening to this and thinking to yourself, man, I'd really like to know Juan or Keith or Ryan's opinion on a certain topic, join our Discord. Just put it in there, and we'll probably cover it at a later date.
Yeah, exactly. We love having these like very specific conversations that are not about a particular game or movie, but I think it enriches the whole experience. And out of all these games, if you would love for us to talk about or give our reactions to any of them in the future, let us know as well. And don't forget, you can leave that 5-star review, whether it be on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Facebook, all that good stuff. You can subscribe over at youtube.com/acastofthepast. And I think, Keith, that's it. We talked some damn words, right?
I think I covered it. So now we need to make a decision. Do we end this podcast, or do we go on for another 3 hours?
Man, like, okay. Does my decision actually affect the outcome, or is this one of those things that it doesn't matter what I say, you're still going to end the show?
I think it falls into the diamond, because no matter what you choose, they have just listened to another episode of a cast
to the
past.
That is so well done, yet I just want to punch you in the face.
That's
it's
me.
like the tone of your voice, because it's like...
It's where I like to live my life.
Oh, love you, Keith.